Summer of 1916, the Canadians moved down to the Somme, and their route to the front line, their conduit to the trenches, was the town of Albe, where I'm standing now. And coming into that town, they noticed civilians still living in it, incredibly, and also the massive tower of the church, the basilica, just behind me here. This became a familiar landmark to all of those who were on the Somme in 1916. And to give some idea of what it looked like, we've got some postcards to show the destruction that took place here during the Great War. This is a pre-war image showing the tower tall and proud as it is today, with the figure of Mary holding her arms out, holding the infant Jesus. This is one that was actually sent during the Great War. The name of the town is struck out by the censor, and on the back of it, it's got the censor stamps showing it had passed and could be sent back to this soldier's family back home in Blighty. But this Red Cross image shows the kind of view that the Canadians had when they came into Albe of the tower of the basilica, with that figure of Mary at this 90-degree angle, having been struck by a shell in 1915. And what happened, a legend grew that when the Virgin fell, the war would end. And indeed it did come down in 1918, but not on Armistice Day. Soldiers gave it all kinds of names: the Golden Virgin, the Leaning Virgin. When the Australians came here, they called it Fanny Durack, who was a pre-war Australian Olympic swimmer who'd won a gold medal for Australia in the 1912 Olympics, and they figured that it looked like Fanny Durack diving into an Olympic swimming pool. But for the Canadians, this was their first landmark on the Somme as they passed through Albe to move up to the front line beyond the destroyed village of Pozières, on the Pozières Ridge, opposite the village of Courcelette. Moving up from the town of Albe, the Canadians came up onto the battle area and took over the positions here on the Pozières Ridge. This is the village of Pozières just to my right here, which had been captured by the Australians. They'd lost 23,000 men in the fighting here in the summer of 1916. And this whole landscape was a lunar landscape of shell holes. It was blasted to oblivion. That was the introduction to the Battle of the Somme that the Canadians had when they took over these trenches here in early September of 1916. And they were getting ready for an assault. This was going to be the Canadian Corps' first attack of the Great War, first liberation of a French village, really important in its history and Canada's history in the 20th century. And some of those who took part in this battle, we can see on these original postcards that I've brought with me. These are men of the 54th Kootenay Battalion who moved up and took part in some of the later fighting at Courcelette, typical of the Canadians that came this way in 1916. And this picture, taken just after the Battle of Courcelette, shows the bandmaster, the regimental sergeant major and the regimental quartermaster sergeant of the 20th Battalion Canadian Expeditionary Force, who were one of those that led the attack on Courcelette village. All three of these men were in the battle here. And the Canadians, and General Byng commanding the Canadians, ready for the battle, going to be supported by tanks in this battle as well, with a huge bombardment, including British and French artillery assisting them. The assault began from the positions where I'm standing now, across these fields and into Courcelette village on the 15th September 1916. As part of the Canadian Corps assault on Courcelette village, tanks were used here for the very first time on the 15th of September 1916 as part officially of the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, when more than 40 tanks were used for the very first time in history to assist British and Canadian units advancing across no man's land. And they formed up here as part of the Canadian Corps sector on this part of the Pozières Ridge before moving to attack Courcelette village and the sugar refinery and sugar trench. Now you imagine being a German soldier that day, seeing one of these tanks move across no man's land towards you. You'd have no idea what it was, with male and female tanks bristling with 6-pounder guns in the case of male tanks, and Vickers machine guns in the case of the female tanks, working in pairs. The Germans, understandably, found it very difficult to stand against that kind of new technology. And this first use of tanks here on the Somme, successfully for the Canadians, would herald a new type of warfare, which 2 years later, the Canadians, again on the Somme, but at Amiens in August 1918, in the great breakout battle there that signalled the last 100 days of the war on the Western Front, resulted in a modern war, a modern battle, and a modern army leading to victory, marching to victory, with tanks very much at the forefront of that kind of warfare. So this first use of them, enabling the Canadians to attack and capture Courcelette village, changed history. On the morning of the 15th of September 1916, the Canadian Corps attacked Courcelette village. They went over the top from the positions on the Pozières Ridge just here and came straight towards where I'm standing. The village of Courcelette was defended by Württemberg troops, German soldiers who had been here for nearly 2 years. There was a long defensive line that had to be cleared by the Canadians. The sugar refinery on the main road was captured with the assistance of the tanks, and then they pushed through these positions into Courcelette village. There was hand-to-hand fighting, there was house-to-house fighting, and symbolically, as this was the liberation of a French village, the French Canadians moved up and they cleared what was left of Courcelette village, going from cellar to cellar, house to house, and pushing through to the far side of the village into the sunken lane. And at the close of fighting on the 15th of September 1916, the Canadians had won a victory here at Courcelette. They'd captured the German positions that faced the Pozières Ridge. They'd captured the village of Courcelette itself and pushed on to the high ground beyond. And up there was another German position known as Regina Trench that would be the scene of later battles. But for now, their position was won, and symbolically, for the first time in the 20th century, Canadians had liberated a village in France. And in terms of what the battlefield here looked like, these postcards that I brought with me, one is an image taken by a German soldier during the Christmas of 1915, which shows the village under snow in fairly good condition because it was quite away from the front line then. It was a billeting village for German soldiers. By the time the Canadians came here, this is what it looked like, smashed to pieces by the bombardments of over 2 months of the Battle of the Somme. And there were a lot of propaganda, because of this Canadian victory, there were a lot of propaganda images that were produced by Canadian photographers and put onto postcard. And this one was colorized at the time and shows a Canadian officer holding up a dog that was captured at Courcelette. And the dog, no doubt, was called Fritz. The Canadians who fell in that attack on the 15th of September 1916 were buried in the village. They were buried on this side of the village, and the cemetery behind me there, Courcelette British Cemetery, was created for the burial of the dead from that early stage of the Courcelette fighting in September 1916 after the war. And I'm going to head up there now to look at the burials. I've come up to Courcelette British Cemetery, which overlooks the battlefield at Courcelette, where the Canadians captured this ground on the 15th of September 1916. And the casualties from that early phase of the fighting are buried in here, from the capture of the village and the pushing through the village to the ground beyond. It's well off the beaten track and a place to come to reflect on the Great War, to think about the casualties. Buried in here, a large number of Canadian soldiers. Almost 50% of the dead are Canadian in this cemetery, many of them unidentified, because Canada lost 24,000 men on the Somme in 1916, of which 8,500 were killed in action or died of wounds, and of them over 6,000 are still missing. So it was really an anvil of sacrifice for Canada in 1916. But of course, most men came home. And when I come here, I think as well of the veterans that I interviewed who survived this war. And one of them was a Canadian soldier, Lance Catamol, who served here with the 21st Battalion Canadian Infantry in the attack on the sugar refinery. And this is his copy of the official story of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, with the Canadian General Service badge on the cover. And when I open it up, it's got a map of the battlefield inside, showing Canadian operations on the Somme in 1916, with the village of Courcelette in the centre and all of the trenches around it. And when I turn it over, we can see his old address sticker in there with his name on and his address in Worthing, where he lived. And I've got this photograph of him taken in Canada in 1915. And Lance Catamol was an underage soldier. He'd lied about his age. He'd emigrated to Canada from Kent before the war with his brothers, and they joined up together. He lied about his age, and when he fought here at Courcelette, he was only 16 years old. He was an underage Tommy, a teenage Tommy. And he was in a bayonet charge on Sugar Trench and the ground around the sugar factory at Courcelette. Their orders were to take no prisoners because of what they were told had been German treachery in earlier battles of the war. And when they captured the trench there, a number of soldiers came out, German soldiers with their hands up, and Lance Catamol, in his memoirs, told this story that as he looked down at these men, 5 bullets struck them at once and they fell dead. Now, when I interviewed him, he was an unusual character in that he would never let me record him. We'd talk about the funny side of the war. This was never mentioned. But he said to me, one day you will read about it. And after he'd passed away, a package came with his memoirs in it, with the full story of his war, including this part of the action at Courcelette when no prisoners were taken. That grim reality, that terrible reality of warfare. And he wrote home to his mother and told her that he'd just been in the Battle of the Somme. She thought he was still in Canada, so she wrote to the Canadian War Office, and they pulled him out of the trenches, age 16, sent him off to the Canadian depot in Sussex, back in Britain, and he remained there for the rest of the war. And by the time he was 18, the war was almost over. He went on to become a commercial artist. He did railway posters in the 1930s. He painted Indian Army uniforms for the Indian Army, and much of his collection is now in the National Army Museum in London. He was one of those incredible witnesses to this events here on this battlefield where Canada broke the German lines on the Somme in September 1916, and for the first time in its history liberated a French village and captured ground. A turning point in the Canadian experience on the Western Front.